Hello, family of the channel. What I'm about to tell you today changed my life forever, and I need to share it because I know many of you have been through something similar. My name is Gabriel, and I'm 52 years old. For most of my life, I was Father Gabriel, a priest at St. Jude's Parish. That church, that community, it was my entire world, my family, and my calling. I spent decades there, serving God and the people, believing I was doing good work, building something meaningful for everyone. Today, you're going to hear my story of revenge, not the kind you might expect, but one born from a deep, painful injustice that shattered everything I knew. You'll discover how I was publicly disgraced, accused of a terrible crime I didn't commit, and cast out from the very place I called home. It's about how I picked myself up from rock bottom and found a way to reclaim my honor, proving that even when the world turns its back, God's truth always finds a way to shine through the darkness. It all began during a solemn diocesan meeting, a formal gathering of clergy where important church matters were discussed, usually with respect and a sense of shared purpose. Bishop Arthur, a man I respected, a man who seemed benevolent and wise, stood before everyone. He was someone I looked up to, someone who held considerable power within our church hierarchy, and his words carried immense weight. Little did I know, that day he would use that power to tear my life apart, piece by agonizing piece, for reasons I couldn't comprehend at the time. Suddenly, his voice cut through the air, sharp and unyielding as he pointed directly at me. He accused me, Father Gabriel, of embezzling a significant amount of funds from the church's safe. Imagine the shock, the absolute disbelief that washed over me and everyone present. He laid out his claims with a chilling certainty, painting me as a deceitful thief, a man who had betrayed his sacred vows and the trust of his flock. It was a public execution of my character happening right before my very eyes, and I was powerless to stop it. I tried to speak, to defend myself, to explain that it was a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding, but my pleas of innocence were immediately dismissed as desperate lies. They wouldn't even let me finish a sentence. I was stripped of my clerical collar right there, in front of my peers and the shocked congregation. The symbol of my life's dedication, torn away without a second thought. I was then escorted out of the church, the place I had served faithfully for decades, my reputation utterly in ruins, just like that. Cast out and excommunicated, my world crumbled. I lost my home, my calling, and the respect of the community I had loved. Parishioners, who once sought my guidance, now averted their eyes or whispered condemnations as I passed. I found myself homeless, destitute, forced to take menial jobs just to put food on the table. One day, while cleaning floors as a janitor, a former parishioner recognized me, spat on me, and called me the thieving priest. That deep humiliation, it cut me to the bone. That moment, combined with the profound spiritual crisis of having my faith and integrity questioned by the very institution I dedicated my life to, solidified something inside me. It wasn't just about clearing my name anymore. It was about exposing the darkness, finding justice for the truth, and understanding why this happened. My faith was tested like never before, but it also became my anchor, reminding me of God's justice. Listen to my story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? Hello, friends. My name is Gabriel. I'm 52, and once I was Father Gabriel. You've heard a glimpse of what happened, how my world was turned upside down. But now, let me take you back to that exact moment, the very second my life shattered, and show you the raw injustice. Listen to this story to the end and tell me, what would you have done in my place? It happened during a solemn diocesan meeting, the kind where you expect reverence and respect, not an ambush. All the clergy were there, gathered in the main hall. Bishop Arthur, a man I had always looked up to, stood before us. He was a figure of authority, his words carrying immense weight. He was the one who was supposed to guide us, to uphold justice. Instead, he became the instrument of my downfall, right there in front of everyone. Suddenly, his voice, usually calm and reassuring, turned sharp, cutting through the hushed room like a knife. He pointed directly at me, his finger shaking slightly, but his gaze unwavering. "Father Gabriel," he declared, his words echoing in the stunned silence, "is guilty of embezzling a significant amount of funds from the church safe." The accusation hung in the air, cold and definitive, painting me as a thief and a betrayer of my sacred vows. My world began to spin. I tried to speak, to defend myself, to explain it was a terrible mistake, a misunderstanding, but my pleas were immediately dismissed. They wouldn't even let me finish a sentence. It was a public execution of my character, unfolding before my very eyes. Then, the ultimate humiliation. I was stripped of my clerical collar right there, a symbol of decades of dedication torn away without a second thought. My life's work, my identity, gone in an instant. The shock turned to a searing pain of betrayal, a deep, raw wound in my spirit. I was escorted out of the church, the place I had called home for so long, my reputation utterly in ruins. That moment wasn't just the end of my priesthood. It was the start of something else entirely. It was the moment I knew, deep in my heart, that I wouldn't just clear my name. I would find justice, no matter the cost. My path was set, and there was no turning back. My world, the one I had built brick by brick, serving God and my community, crumbled in an instant. Stripped of my collar, I was cast out, literally and figuratively, from the only home I'd known for decades. The rectory, once my sanctuary, became a forbidden place. I had no savings, no possessions beyond a few worn clothes and my Bible. Suddenly, I was just Gabriel, a man with no title, no purpose, and nowhere to go. The streets became my unwelcome new reality. I remember those first few nights, sleeping on park benches, the cold biting at my bones, the sounds of the city a stark contrast to the quiet reverence of my old life. Every sunrise felt like a fresh reminder of my utter destitution. It was a humiliation I never imagined a priest, or any man, would have to endure. Finding work was nearly impossible. Who would hire an ex-priest, publicly accused of theft? The few odd jobs I managed to scrounge up were always cash in hand, usually involving heavy lifting or scrubbing floors. Each day was a battle for survival, a constant reminder of how far I had fallen, from spiritual leader to an anonymous laborer. The hardest part wasn't the physical hardship, but the way people looked at me. Their eyes, once filled with respect and trust, now held suspicion, pity, or outright disdain. I saw it in the faces of strangers, and it cut deeper than any cold wind or empty stomach ever could. I was a pariah, a ghost haunting the edges of a life that was no longer mine. Former parishioners, people I had baptized, married, and comforted in their darkest hours, would actively avoid me. I'd see them on the street, and their gazes would dart away, their steps quickening. It was as if my presence tainted them, a silent accusation that I was not worthy of even a passing glance, let alone a kind word. Sometimes, I'd overhear whispers as I passed, "Isn't that Father Gabriel, the one who stole from the church?" The hushed tones were worse than shouts, carrying a venomous sting. Each whisper chipped away at my spirit, reinforcing the public narrative that I was a thief, a betrayer, a man who had failed God and his flock. The isolation was crushing. I had dedicated my life to community, to being there for others, and now I was utterly alone. Sundays were the worst, hearing the church bells chime, knowing that inside, life continued as if I had never existed, as if my decades of service meant absolutely nothing. It was a profound loneliness that pierced my soul. Financially, I was ruined. Every penny I earned went towards stale bread and a cheap room for a night or two. There was no thought of comfort, only survival. The idea of having a secure future, or even a modest meal, felt like an impossible dream. My entire life savings, which were minimal to begin with, had been absorbed by legal fees I couldn't afford. My home became a rotating cast of dingy shelters and hidden corners, each one a testament to my fall from grace. I yearned for the simple dignity of a private space, a place to pray without fear of judgment. But that luxury was long gone, replaced by the harsh reality of living on the margins. My faith, once an unshakable foundation, was now tested in ways I never imagined. How could God allow such an injustice? I spent countless hours wrestling with doubt, questioning everything I believed. Was my life's work a lie? Had I been so blind? These were dark, soul-crushing questions that haunted my waking moments. I felt a profound spiritual crisis, as if the very institution I dedicated my life to had not only abandoned me, but actively tried to erase my existence. My integrity, my very soul, had been called into question by the people I trusted most. It was a betrayal that went beyond the physical, a wound inflicted directly on my spirit. The sting of being forgotten, or worse, condemned, was a constant companion. It wasn't just that I was poor or homeless. It was the loss of identity, the erasure of everything I had been. I was no longer Father Gabriel, a pillar of the community. I was just a nameless, disgraced man, a cautionary tale. Meanwhile, I heard snippets of news about Bishop Arthur. He seemed to be thriving, his reputation untouched, perhaps even enhanced by cleansing the church of a supposed thief. He was moving up, gaining more influence, while I was scraping by, fighting for scraps. The injustice of it all burned like a fire in my gut. I'd hear people talk about his new initiatives, his eloquent sermons, his strong leadership. Each compliment felt like a personal insult, a twist of the knife. It was a bitter pill to swallow, knowing that the man who orchestrated my downfall was now basking in the glory he had stolen from my life. His prosperity built upon my ruin was a constant, gnawing pain. While I struggled to find enough to eat, he was enjoying lavish dinners, making important connections, and expanding his power. The stark contrast between our fates was a cruel mockery of justice, an affront to everything I believed was right. One particularly low point came when I found work as a janitor in a local office building, the kind of anonymous job where you blend into the background. It paid just enough to keep me from starving, but it was a world away from the dignity of my past life. I cleaned toilets, scrubbed floors, and emptied trash cans. One afternoon, as I was pushing my cleaning cart down a hallway, a familiar face appeared. It was Mrs. Henderson, a long-time parishioner from St. Jude's, a woman whose children I had baptized. Her eyes widened in recognition, then narrowed with disgust. My heart sank, knowing what was coming. The thieving priest, she spat, her voice laced with venom, her face contorted in a sneer. Before I could even react, she raised her hand and spat directly on my chest, right over the spot where my clerical collar used to rest. She turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, frozen, utterly humiliated. That moment, the spittle still wet on my shirt, something shifted inside me. The shame, the pain, the profound sense of injustice. It all crystallized into a burning resolve. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about the truth, about God's justice, and about exposing the darkness that had consumed my life. I realized then that my personal suffering was a symptom of a deeper sickness within the church, a corruption that Bishop Arthur represented. He hadn't just destroyed my life. He had betrayed the trust of the faithful, defiled the sanctity of the institution, and mocked the very principles of Christian charity. The injustice wasn't just a wound on me, it was a wound on the community, on the church, and on the very idea of truth. My faith, though tested to its core, began to re-emerge, not as a passive acceptance, but as an active call to righteousness. God's truth, I knew, would always find a way to shine. I couldn't just wallow in despair. The shame, the humiliation, the absolute degradation I had endured, it all fueled a quiet, unyielding determination. I knew deep in my bones that I had to fight back, not with anger but with purpose. My spirit, though broken, was not defeated. A new kind of resolve began to take root in my heart. It wasn't about bitter revenge in the worldly sense, but about seeking a divine justice, a restoration of truth and honor. I would not allow such a profound lie to stand. This was not just for me, but for every soul who had been misled. I knew the path ahead would be difficult, fraught with danger, and demand every ounce of strength I possessed. but looking at the stained fabric of my shirt, I understood that this humiliation was a crucible. I was at the bottom, but from this rock bottom I would begin to rise, guided by a righteous fire. The determination solidified into a quiet vow. I would find a way to expose the truth, to reclaim my name, and to ensure that Bishop Arthur faced the consequences of his malicious actions. My journey from priest to pariah was over. Now, a new, unforeseen path of justice was beginning. My world was still a mess, shattered into a million pieces, but a tiny flicker of hope, or maybe just pure stubbornness, kept me going. After weeks of scraping by, I finally got permission to retrieve the last few personal items from the rectory. It was a painful trip back to a place that felt like a tomb of my former life, haunted by memories of everything I'd lost. Each step echoed with the silence of a life that was no longer mine. I walked through the empty rooms, touching familiar objects that now felt alien, like artifacts from another man's existence. The rectory was being prepared for someone new, and I felt like a ghost in my own home. My few books, a worn crucifix, some old clothes, that was all that remained. It was a stark reminder of how little I truly owned, how quickly everything could vanish. As I was gathering my things, I found myself in the old confessional booth. It was a small, familiar space, usually filled with hushed whispers and solemn promises. I ran my hand along the rough wood, remembering countless hours spent listening, guiding, and absolving. It was a place of secrets, a sacred trust, and I felt a strange pull to check one last time. Tucked deep into a hidden compartment, almost forgotten, I felt a piece of paper. My fingers trembled as I pulled it out. It was an old, yellowed envelope, sealed and addressed to me, but clearly never delivered. My heart hammered against my ribs. Who would send me a letter and hide it here? What could it possibly contain after all this time? I tore it open, my breath catching in my throat. Inside, in a shaky, familiar handwriting, was a letter from Deacon Silas. Deacon Silas, a man I had known for years, a trusted official within the church, but one I knew had been struggling with some financial issues. The words on the page blurred for a moment as my eyes scanned them, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. Then it hit me, like a punch to the gut. The letter was a confession. Deacon Silas, in his own hand, detailed how he had stolen the funds from the church safe. He wrote about his desperation, his shame, and his profound regret. My mind reeled. All this time it wasn't me. It was him. The truth was staring me in the face, raw and undeniable. But the letter didn't stop there. My blood ran cold as I read on, realizing the full extent of the betrayal. Deacon Silas explicitly stated that Bishop Arthur had discovered his theft, but instead of bringing him to justice, the bishop had orchestrated the entire frame-up. He had knowingly accused me, Father Gabriel, to protect the church's image, and more disturbingly, his own rising career. The bishop had used me as a scapegoat, sacrificing my life and reputation to climb higher. He had twisted the sacred trust of the church for his own ambition, knowing full well I was innocent. The pain of betrayal was immense, but it was now mixed with a burning righteous fury. This wasn't just a confession. It was irrefutable proof of my innocence and Bishop Arthur's calculated malice. This letter, hidden away for so long, was a revelation straight from God, I believed. It wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a key, a weapon, a lifeline. The despair I had carried for months began to recede, replaced by a quiet, unyielding resolve. My name could be cleared. The truth could finally come out. This was the turning point I never dared to dream of. Bishop Arthur, in his arrogance, had completely underestimated me. He saw me as a simple, trusting priest, easily discarded, a man whose spirit would break under the weight of public shame. He thought I would fade away, a forgotten footnote in his ascent to power. He never imagined I possessed the strength, or, now, the intelligence to fight back, let alone the evidence. My years in the confessional, listening to the deepest secrets and struggles of humanity, had unknowingly prepared me for this moment. I had learned to read people, to understand their motives, their fears, and the intricate dance of power and deceit within the church hierarchy. This wasn't just a spiritual gift. It was a sharp, analytical mind, honed by decades of quiet observation. My faith, which had been so severely tested, now became my ultimate anchor. The words of Isaiah chapter 30 verse 18 echoed in my heart. The Lord is a God of justice. This wasn't about bitter worldly revenge. It was about seeking God's justice, about exposing the darkness that had defiled our sacred institution. My mission was now clear, guided by a higher purpose. This letter, combined with my intimate knowledge of the church's inner workings and my unwavering faith, was the hidden resource Bishop Arthur never considered. He thought he had buried the truth and me along with it. But God works in mysterious ways, and sometimes the truth is found in the most unexpected places, waiting to be unearthed. The path ahead would be dangerous, requiring every ounce of courage and cunning I possessed. But the humiliation, the pain, the injustice, it all solidified into a quiet, unshakable determination. I would not rest until Bishop Arthur faced the consequences of his actions. This was no longer just about me. It was about justice for every soul he had misled. Bishop Arthur had built his empire on a foundation of lies and my ruined life. He never accounted for a forgotten letter, or for the quiet strength of a man he thought he had utterly destroyed. He was about to learn that even a disgraced priest, guided by faith and armed with truth, could bring down the mightiest of walls. Before revealing how the revenge happened, it's very important that you subscribe to the channel and leave a like on the video, so that YouTube recommends this incredible story to more people, thus helping us spread the gospel through real stories of testimonies. So please, help us in this noble cause. My plan wasn't about shouting from the rooftops or confronting Bishop Arthur directly. That was his game, and I wouldn't play it. Instead, I carefully sought out specific individuals. First, a couple of older, respected priests I knew were growing increasingly disillusioned with Arthur's ambitious ways. They had seen too many good people pushed aside. Then, I found an investigative journalist known for tackling tough stories, especially those involving powerful institutions. I approached them with extreme caution, weaving a tale that hinted at deep-seated corruption without revealing all my cards at once. I needed their trust, and I needed them to see the truth for themselves. I didn't hand them the letter right away. That was my ace. Instead, I gave them pieces of information, subtle hints about discrepancies in the church's accounts, whispers of questionable land deals Bishop Arthur had overseen, and how certain loyalties seemed to shift unnaturally fast. It was like dropping pebbles into a pond, watching the ripples spread. The priests began asking questions in hushed tones, while the journalists started digging, following the faint trail I had laid. I knew Arthur was shrewd, but he was also arrogant. He wouldn't expect a disgraced former priest to be orchestrating such a delicate campaign. The pressure slowly mounted. I heard through my contacts that Arthur was becoming agitated, dismissing the growing concerns as petty gossip. But the journalists' inquiries, though subtle, were more persistent. They started asking about specific dates and transactions, things only an insider would know. Arthur, feeling the walls close in, began to make mistakes. He tried to silence one of the older priests with a transfer, which only solidified the priest's suspicions. He also attempted to block the journalist's access to certain records, a move that screamed guilt rather than innocence. His true manipulative nature started to peek through his polished facade. I knew the perfect moment to deliver the final blow. Bishop Arthur was scheduled to address the crucial diocesan synod, a meeting where he expected to secure a major promotion, cementing his power. It was to be his triumphant moment, his ultimate ascent. I imagined him, standing tall, basking in the adoration of his peers, completely oblivious to the storm I had meticulously brewed. The thought of him, so close to his ill-gotten victory, only hardened my resolve. This wasn't just about exposing him. It was about ensuring his downfall was public, undeniable, and utterly devastating. The stage was set for justice. On the day of the synod, the hall buzzed with anticipation. Arthur, resplendent in his vestments, began his address, his voice booming with false confidence. Just as he launched into a particularly self-congratulatory passage, I walked in. I wasn't the broken, humiliated priest they remembered. My clothes were simple, but my stance was firm, my eyes clear. A hush fell over the room as every head turned. I didn't say a word. I simply walked to the front, pulled out Deacon Silas's letter, and laid it on the podium, along with the other meticulously gathered evidence. The journalist, already present, began to snap pictures. Bishop Arthur's face, initially a mask of confusion, slowly drained of all color as his eyes fixed on the letter. The room erupted in murmurs, then gasps. As the implications settled, the journalist, now with undeniable proof, began to furiously type on a small device, ready to break the story. Arthur tried to speak, but his voice was a strangled whisper, his carefully constructed facade crumbling before everyone. He was stripped of his authority right there, his promotion vanishing into thin air. The humiliation was absolute, a public disgrace far worse than what I had endured, because his guilt was undeniable. My name was cleared, not with shouts or grand speeches, but with the quiet, irrefutable power of truth. Bishop Arthur, stripped of his title and reputation, was escorted out, much like I had been, but this time he was the one truly disgraced, facing investigations and legal action. Deacon Silas was also held accountable for his part. As for me, I felt a profound sense of peace. Justice had been served. I stood there, no longer a priest, but a man restored, my dignity reclaimed. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was filled with the quiet triumph of righteousness, a testament to God's unwavering justice, finally revealed.